Welcome to Westminster Watch, and I'm Nick de Bois. On this week's show, we're asking, is the UK's voting system unfair to smaller parties? This was a monumental election, not just for the Labour Party, who won by a landslide, but for smaller parties, whose gains show voter appetite goes beyond the two-party system. But the UK's first-past-the-post electoral system, in which the candidate who receives the most votes wins, means there's only one political party in power. And since the general election, many have been calling for this to change. Before we hear from our guests about how voting reform might look, let's remind ourselves exactly how the UK's smaller political parties performed in the general election. There's no denying that for such a new party, Reform UK made their presence known. They won roughly 4 million votes across the country. This translates into a 14% share of total votes cast, but only 1% of all the seats in the House of Commons, something Reform leader Nigel Farage thinks should change.
Our outdated, first-past-the-post electoral system is not fit for purpose, and we will campaign with anyone and everyone to change this electoral system.
The Liberal Democrats won 12% of the vote share and 11% of the seats. Like Reform UK, the Green Party also had a larger vote share than seat share, with 7% of the votes translating to 1% of the total seats. By contrast, Labour won 34% of the total votes cast, but about 64% of the 650 seats. That's a gap of 30 percentage points, the most disproportionate on record. So how would a proportional system have changed things? Well, if the amount of votes translated exactly into the number of seats, Labour would currently be on 221 seats and no majority. The Tories would have 156, Reform 91, Liberal Democrats 78, and the Greens 45. In the past, Labour's membership have voted overwhelmingly in favour of reforming the electoral system. It was a sentiment echoed by the party's leader and new Prime Minister Keir Starmer back in 2020.
On electoral reform, we've got to address the fact that millions of people vote in safe seats and they feel their vote doesn't count. And that's got to be addressed. We will never get full participation in our electoral system until we do that at every level. So we need to address that.
More recently, however, the Labour leader has changed his tune. Joining me to discuss this further are former Conservative Special Advisor Charlie Rowley and political commentator Alex Armstrong. Welcome to you both. Charlie, you support first past the post, the system we have at the moment. But the bottom line is, do you not support the idea seats won should match the votes cast?
I do, if you have a system that doesn't recognise the local element or the constituency element of being a member of Parliament. So what we currently have is a situation whereby, a group of people in a particular constituency vote for who they want to be their local champion, their local representative in Parliament. It's not just dealing with the national issues. It's not just dealing with votes on a national basis. You've got to have that local element attached to it. And it would be simply unfair if you then decide that just on a popular vote and you distribute those seats up across the country, that all of a sudden you could find yourself in an area where you might have voted, heavens above, Lib Dem in the southwest, and you find yourself with a Reform MP. That would simply not be fair at all. So you've got to recognise the system that we currently have, first past the post, where people in certain geographies, small geographies, where the electorate is equal up to about 80,000 people, they all get to have a say who they want to be their local champion, their local voice to be in Parliament, and it's that person that wins.
Alex, it's a fair point, and I think you look at this differently, but the reality is, when I was an MP, if they liked me, they'd re-vote and give me my job back. If they didn't, they'd kick me out. That's harder to do with any sort of form of proportional representation, isn't it?
Well, it may very well be the case. I mean, we're yet to decide or talk about what that PR system would be. I quite like the STV, the single transferable vote, myself. But we have to remember, first past the post is an ancient system that only we, the last country in Europe, adopt fully. This is wrong. Our 43 other European friends have decided this is...
If you look around the world, though, whilst proportional representation is far greater,
yes,
there's actually quite a few more countries.
Well, it depends on who we'd like to be compared to around the world, and I think our European colleagues are pretty good when it comes to democracy, which I think is something we should all believe in, personally. And look, this only favours the two big parties, and of course Charlie is going to sit here and defend it, because if people like Charlie want to get into Parliament one day, they're going to need first past the post to do that. But even so, had we had a proportional representation system in this election, the Tories would have won more votes and they would have stopped this supermajority that nobody's voted for. And I'll just add, the electorate are massively dissatisfied with our current system. The Electoral Commission launched a report last year that showed that they're massively in favour of changing our system.
14% of the share of the vote went to Reform. They got 5 seats. 12% went to those Liberal Democrats you've just mentioned. They got 72 seats. How on any basis can that be fair?
Because in the areas where the Lib Dems did pick up all those seats, they won over 50% of the vote in those particular geographies. So I think it would be, again, unfair to say to an area that did not vote necessarily for Reform or didn't vote Conservative, but ends up with an MP where a large proportion of people in that particular constituency didn't vote for that Member of Parliament, ends up with an MP just by default of what other people might be thinking in another part of the country. Geography matters. Geography matters. There are issues in the southwest that we don't hear about in London or that you don't hear about in the northeast. That's why you see when the campaigns kick off, when the political parties campaign on local issues, it is local people that decide who they want to represent them.
This is at the cost of massive disenfranchisement of the electorate. We're talking about the lowest turnout in this election since the universal suffrage and a sweeping majority for Labour, which nobody voted for. Let's be clear about that. Nobody voted for a supermajority of Labour. They received less votes than when Jeremy Corbyn was Prime Minister, Leader of the Opposition. And we have to have a realistic conversation about where we want our democracy to be and whether we want more people to be engaged in it or less. We're seeing this trend downwards and we're seeing this massive dissatisfaction. We need more parties to be represented in Parliament as our views as a country have become more representative of smaller parties.
But I'll just take that on because, I'm all for greater representation and for more people coming into politics. And you've seen an increase in the number of Lib Dem MPs. You've seen an increase, certainly, in the number of Labour MPs. You've seen the start of a number of Reform MPs coming in. There are a number of Reform candidates came second in a lot of those constituencies. Now, if they crack on and push on and campaign in the way that they currently have, if people are still dissatisfied with the government of the day, by the way, a government that has shifted from an 80-seat Conservative majority to over an 181, I think, Labour majority. So
he's got a point.
You can have change.
It does work in that sense. Admittedly, it's Labour, Conservative, Labour.
Yep.
But it's kind of a huge shift that you probably wouldn't even see in proportional representation.
Correct, but what you would see is those smaller parties actually getting a voice in government at some point in time. We've only ever had, is it 2 hung parliaments since 1945?
Yes, but Alex, are you really a Democrat if you think it's a good idea to have an electoral system that, as happened in 2010, right, under proportional representation, we would see more coalition governments, and surely a Democrat wouldn't want to have a stitch-up of what policies to accept only hours after the electorate have voted on manifestos. They just get in a room together, these parties, when they want to form an alliance to govern, and kick the manifestos out the window.
Well, but that certainly can be the case. I think what we saw with the Liberal Democrats and the Tories was a relatively good adjustment of the policies based on what the electorate wanted.
Really? The Liberal Democrats blew out, they got rid of one policy on tuition fees, and they were punished ruthlessly.
Absolutely, and so they should be, and they maybe caved in on the wrong policies there, but that was the party leader's decision to do so, and he was punished, of course, later on by the electorate for doing so. So that's, of course, part of this alliance system. But it does mean that the wider majority, we're talking about a Labour government here with 30% of the electorate actually wanting this manifesto. If there was a broader coalition, you will add those numbers up to nearer 50% where we should be. We can't claim to be Democrats when we have a supermajority government with 30% of the votes.
34%.
34% to be precise. And and then not have any more representation.
Your
from those other
system is
parties.
giving power to a minority party.
No, I don't think it is.
34% share of the votes is not a majority. 2 out of 3 people did not vote for a government that's got 411 majority.
No, but they would have voted for other minor parties that might, if it were a coalition, so they probably might have voted for the Lib Dems, they might have voted for the Greens as well. If you tot all that up, they might have voted for the Socialist Workers' Party. So between those people, they might have added up to representing something more like the Labour Party. But no system is perfect. Let's start with that, because even if you take America, if we were just basing this on a popular vote and a vote share, Hillary Clinton would have won the presidency in 2016. Well, they have a different system because it's collegiate, and I don't want to detract from that, but it is something similar to be said in this country, that we have a system.
But your first past the post argument, you kicked off by saying something that I think is very important, that by choosing your representative, you're choosing someone to represent your local area, you have a relationship with that person. You can hire or fire them at a subsequent election. But deep down, the vast majority of people, they vote either for a party or for a leader. They're not really voting for Joe Bloggs, who's their local MP, are they?
I think there's a fair element of that, and that's why I think it's about delivery in government. So if you take immigration as a topic that this election was based on, Reform picked up a huge number of votes, the millions that you talked about, on the failures of the Conservative government, on the back of the Conservative government failing to deal with immigration. Now, the Labour government have to tackle it in a particular way. They've decided to get rid of the rounder policy and a deterrent there. Let's see what else they do in the coming weeks and months. But if the electorate are so dissatisfied in the numbers of which we've seen under the Conservative government, which is why they've switched, because of incompetence and other things, but let's take immigration. Reform have done well on the back of those votes and those disaffected voters. If Labour grapple it, they'll get re-elected. Reform's vote will go down. And then you wouldn't be there sitting here saying, oh, well, Reform should still have a number of seats because they want to hold the government's feet to the fire. The government would either deliver or it hasn't, and people can switch to alternatives. So in 5 years' time, if Labour don't deliver on levelling up, if they don't deliver on tackling immigration, then people will look to who came second place in some of those constituencies. It might be Reform. People might vote Reform, or they'll switch back to the Tories.
Well, I don't think people voted for Labour based on their immigration policy, so I think your argument's slightly flawed there. The Labour won because the Tory vote collapsed, and a lot of it went to Reform for people who did want to solve this immigration crisis now. And that's the problem, is that there's still, the electorate are crying out for change, and Labour will not deliver that change. We know that their policies on immigration are going to be very weak. We've already seen the deterrent, as you correctly suggested, has been completely abolished by the Labour Party. So we're actually not going to get what people are voting for on the right wing of the back of the Tory failures. They're going to get the exact opposite of that now.
But you see, isn't this really missing the point? Whether you have first past the post or whether you have a proportional representation system, you're really talking about how you elect your government and your representatives. What they do could be pretty useless under either system. So let's bring it back, if I may, to the substance of should there be an alternative voting system? And I choose those words carefully because in 2012, there was a referendum on the alternative voting system, a version of proportional representation, soundly rejected by the public. Why do you think the public will have changed their mind?
Well, I think the political landscape has dramatically changed since those days. And if you look at how many smaller parties were really gagging for electoral reform at the time, it was simply just the Liberal Democrats. Now we're talking about millions of people in many smaller parties, the Greens, which didn't have any representation really other than one seat. We're talking about Reform, which now has 5 seats. We may even get the SNP calling for it as well. There's a lot of smaller parties who represent millions of people across this country who are calling for this now, including the Liberal Democrats, might I add, who are going to make that case a lot stronger. I do think that the system put forward, I think it was AV, particularly by the Lib Dems, was a flawed system, and there's better discussions to be had. And we can now look to our European colleagues and say what works well, what hasn't worked well, and actually, do we want a fairer system? I think the dissatisfaction with the major parties is rife. The uni-parties.
What happened to the idea, whether it's Scottish nationalism, whether it's Brexit, that there's a once-in-the-lifetime moment is reflected by a referendum that lifetime's been shortened to about 12 years by you to argue the case for change. It's a bit of a cheek, isn't it?
Well, yes, look, I appreciate that. I will contradict myself a little bit here because I wouldn't like to have a second referendum on Brexit. However, I do think that's a massive, monumental shift in our international sovereignty and many other things that really are a quite critical thing for Britain. Changing the voting system is far less critical to our trading relations, our foreign relations, and therefore I think we can take our internal politics a little less seriously and the impact that would have on our country. So I do think we should look at them as different things. But the British public, you know, I think will deserve another chance to discuss this properly with more voices in the mix and more parties making a statement on this too.
Do you think that maybe Alex and his supporters are banging their head against a brick wall? Because even though the Tory party has been reduced so substantially to 121 seats, and frankly could probably benefit under PR, who knows, that actually the conspiracy against allowing voting reform will continue?
I think it's difficult because I think what we talked about turnout being so low in this election, I think turnout will only be increasingly lower, if I can put it like that, if you have a PR system where people might not understand, where they don't have someone who they vote for, where you might end up with smaller coalitions. Not only did people reject the referendum...
It didn't stop your party introducing voter ID. Some people might say voter ID is one of the reasons that actually voting turnout dropped.
Well, I think it's perfectly acceptable to turn up. If you're going to vote in your country's democracy, you know, the one thing that we all hold dear and that we should all rely to, that make laws on behalf of all of us, you should actually be someone that has, that you are who you say you are. I think there have been too many occasions in certain constituencies where I think that...
Hardly any prosecutions, but we'll save that for another day. I guess what I'm pointing to there, though, is there's a little bit of double standards there, isn't? If you're saying, we'll make a dramatic change to voting process, i.e. ID cards, because, who knows, it's in our interest to actually have people show they are who they are when they vote, but we won't go any further when it comes to actually changing the process of voting from first past the post to AV. A little bit of double standards there.
I don't think so, because it's well understood our voting system at the minute. I think just showing ID is something that's perfectly
Boris Johnson
acceptable.
was able to do it.
But I wouldn't talk... I mean, you always hear the idea of a PR system or a different voting system from smaller parties, and I understand that because they might get a larger vote share.
Party now.
And smaller, but not you know, we've got some work to do to get... But smaller parties are talking themselves down. You know, the Lib Dems have just, under this system, the first past list, got up to 70 MPs, 75 MPs, whatever it is. You know, Reform are now on. They have MPs in Parliament. And if Labour, if the government don't deliver what they say they're going to deliver, and if there are other parties in Parliament, say, for example, the Tory party, where a lot of the votes shifted to Reform, if they don't get their act together, if they don't start articulating the policies that the people of this country want, then Reform, who came second in a number of those constituencies that were both Conservative-facing, that were both Labour-facing, then they will get more seats in Parliament. That is just how it works. That's something we all understand. And I don't think you should talk yourself down so much if you're a Reform supporter to say, well, we need a different system.
I want to talk about fairness in our political system, whether it's smaller parties or large parties. In fact, the Tories would have done much better under PR as well. So it's not just the smaller parties who should be talking about this. We should all be talking about it. I just want to go back to the point on voters not understanding the system. It's quite straightforward if you had something like STV to put 1, 2, 3, 4 and 5 in a box. I think we really underestimate the British public if we don't think they're capable of doing that, Charlie.
But I take comfort from the fact that, and I do, maybe it sounds to you crackers, but, you know, even if I didn't vote for the MP that is elected at the end of the day, they might be a completely opposite, you know, political persuasion that I am. But I take comfort from the fact that my neighbours and my community, as a majority in the area that I live in, where there are going to be so many different local issues compared to somewhere else in the country, that those people that I live next door, people that I go to cafes with, people that I might see in the high street or whatever, they voted for someone who is now going to be our elected representative.
So
I might fundamentally disagree with them.
There's a policy discussion to be had on that. There's a policy discussion to be had on that. But what we're saying here is who's going to be in state government, your local
someone that the
representative, no
majority
matter...
of people
Are
voted
you
for,
telling
I
me
would
that
have
a
thought.
Reform candidate couldn't sit down and do local issues over a Liberal Democrat? That's nonsense. What we're talking about here, who is going to form the government that decides the domestic and foreign policy of our country? And you can't have... You will never get representation of those. But of course it is. Of course it is.
No, because who makes up the government is who has most seats in Parliament, is invited by His Majesty the King to
Quite.
form that government, who can command the confidence of the House
And
government.
I'm telling you now, Charlie, most people vote for the party. Most people go out and they don't care who the candidates are a lot of the time. There's some small politicos like yourself and me and you, but I bet if you did a poll of your local residents...
George Galloway. Tell that to Thangam Debonair, who was popular Labour MPs that have lost it, and George Galloway not so, I know, but they lost their seats on the
These
back
are big
of
public figures.
on
So you
local
can't
issues.
compare
But
big
are
public
you
figures.
seriously suggesting that they lost it, right, because they were who they were as a person, or they lost it because people were voting on party issues, more like?
Well, I think you can... party issues, I think there obviously are the national and international events that perhaps lost Thangam Debonair her seat and Jonathan Ashworth. But if you take the case of what would have been a safe Tory seat in, I think, other than Bill Ricky, that was our former party chairman, Rick Holden, that made a chicken run move from the northeast to the east of England, came within 20 votes, which should have been a Tory, because the people there, OK, he just squeaked in, but local people there, I don't think were as keen to have him as the local member of
but
Parliament.
Charlie, OK.
So personality
A
does
great
matter.
example to pick up, but we all know that both parties, the major parties, have the practice of dropping in, shoehorning in their favourite special advisors. Not you yet. They drop in their special. You look down in the home counties. You had people like Laura Trott, who'd worked in senior offices. Claire Cortinio, who was a special advisor to the chief whip. They were all dropped into those seats. And let's be honest, they could have had donkeys with blue rosettes on up until the last election. They would have won. That the idea that they're all voting for a candidate, most people say a candidate has a personal vote of anywhere between 200 and maybe 500 votes. They're not these days, are they?
Well, I don't know. I mean, look, Jeremy Corbyn's another example who, just on the back of being a personality and a person you held on to that seat as an independent, not even as a Labour MP. So I don't know about that. But I do think the voting system doesn't need to change. I think what has changed are people's interest in politics. So politics has become more volatile. There are more people that are prepared to change their vote. We don't have these lifelong staunch Tories anymore. We don't have these lifelong Labour people anymore. They are prepared now to put their cross in a box for alternative parties or smaller parties or up-and-coming parties, whichever way you want to describe it. So I don't think it is the case now that it's just going to be a two-party system, even under the current voting system that we have. Smaller parties can come through under the current system.
Sure, but your examples of Jeremy Corbyn, Nigel Farage, these are big public names. These are big public names, and we cannot compare them. The reason why Reform won so many seats, Lee Anderson, big name, Richard Tice, big name, Nigel, that's 3 of the 5 there, big names. And they win because of their recognition on television, in media. And so I think this argument, yes, well, we can say that, is that a right, is that wrong, is that right, is a good thing. But the reality is that people are voting for parties. They are voting in that direction.
No, I'd go further. They're voting for presidents, aren't they?
Correct.
Starmer versus Sunak. He lost you the election, after all, most people would say. So again, the relevance of the local MP is coming into question. But let me move you on towards this as we bring this to a close. You get a sense of the fierce resistance to change you are going to come across. And this is not some old fuddy-duddy, dyed-in-the-wool Conservative or Labour politician we're talking to, same generation as you. I mean, Reform, for example, they're doomed, really, aren't they? Because they've got nowhere to go unless PR comes in, and they're not going to get it.
Well, you could be quite right there, Nick. I do think the calls for PR amongst the general population are going to get stronger and stronger. And it may not happen in the next election, but it may not happen the one after that, but it will happen. Political change will happen in this country at some point in time. And I do think we could be headed to a hung parliament next election if the major, the majority of Labour fail to deliver the promises that they've kept. And I think the public's satisfaction with the major parties is weak.
One thing we can guarantee, last question to you, Joe, one thing we can guarantee is, because it happens to all governments, is that they are going to get more unpopular as time progresses. But can you actually live with the fact that we've elected a government with 34% share of the vote that will become increasingly unpopular. And the reason they got those seats is actually because you and colleagues believe that the system that they're elected on is the best, produces the best form of government we can get in this country.
Well, no system is perfect, but I do think it is the best one in terms of fairness because of the local element to it. I think if we had a different political system in general, where you had maybe stronger local authorities, whether that was, whatever, I know we have local elections, but if you were just solely electing people on a national issue basis for your parliament, then it could be different. But I think the way in which you've seen the volatility from an 80-seat Conservative majority to now 181 Labour majority shows that people can change their minds pretty quickly.
Well,
turnout was
we shall see. I'm pleased to say we're a long way from the next general election. I'm pleased to say thank you, gentlemen, for joining us here on Westminster Watch. Indeed, thanks again to all my guests for joining me. And don't forget to subscribe to the TRT World YouTube channel for more lively debate and conversation. But for now, from me and all the team here, goodbye, and thank you for watching.